You know that feeling when something doesn't sit right in your gut, when the smallest detail feels off, like a single wrong note in a symphony that everyone else seems to have missed. It's not a dramatic sensation. It doesn't arrive with sirens or alarm bells. It's quieter than that. It's the prickling awareness at the back of your neck when you walk into a room and sense that the temperature is 1 degree lower than it should be. You can't prove it. You can't point to it. But you know, in that bone-deep way that experience builds over decades, that something is wrong. That was the feeling I carried into work on a Tuesday morning in early November, climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor of Sterling Dynamics' Glasgow office on West George Street, past the framed photographs of container ships and distribution centres that lined the walls, past the coffee station where Paul from procurement was filling his 2nd mug of the day, past the glass-walled meeting rooms where the city skyline stretched grey and familiar behind the windows. That was the feeling in my chest when Marcus from IT security appeared in the corridor outside conference room 3, his face 2 shades paler than usual, a manila folder pressed against his chest like a shield. Marcus Webb, 26 years old. Brilliant kid, the kind of methodical, quiet genius type that every security team needs and rarely appreciates properly. He joined Sterling fresh from his master's at Strathclyde 18 months prior, and in that time he'd rebuilt our endpoint monitoring infrastructure from scratch. He cared about his work with a seriousness that reminded me of myself at that age, and I'd made a point of mentioning it to his line manager twice. He had that particular quality that distinguishes the best security professionals from the merely competent ones. He didn't just look for anomalies in data, he looked for the human patterns behind them. He understood that every security breach was, at its root, a story about a person making choices they believed would go unnoticed. "Mr. Sutherland," he said quietly when he spotted me. His voice was low, controlled, but his knuckles around the folder were white. "Could I speak with you privately, sir? It's urgent." We stepped into the alcove near the emergency stairwell, away from foot traffic. Marcus opened the folder and turned it toward me, his security report. Log entries time-stamped over the past 3 weeks, IP addresses, access times. I looked at the pattern on the page, and I let my face do what anyone's face would do when reading something alarming for the first time. I allowed my eyes to move slowly across the data the way someone would when encountering it fresh. I let a small furrow form between my brows. I let the silence extend naturally before I looked up. "Someone has been accessing your computer every night at 3 a.m., Marcus said, "from inside your house." I already knew. I'd known for 17 days. But here's the thing about being good at something for a long time, really good. The kind of good that comes from 12 years of building network security architecture before you ever moved into operations management. The kind of good that comes from designing penetration testing protocols for GCHC contractors. From spending years thinking about systems not as collections of hardware, but as ecosystems, with vulnerabilities that mirror the people who build them. When you've spent that kind of time inside the machinery of how information moves and how it can be intercepted, you develop a particular quality of patience. You learn to wait, you learn to watch, and sometimes, more importantly, you learn to let other people believe they're watching you. I looked at Marcus and let the appropriate amount of concern settle across my face. "That's deeply troubling," I said. "Thank you for bringing this to me directly. I wanted to come to you first, before filing a formal report," he said carefully, "given the sensitivity of the files involved and your position." He was watching me the way careful people watch when they're genuinely uncertain, when they've uncovered something that might be a crisis, or might be something they don't yet have context for, and the difference matters enormously. I could see him weighing his own read of the situation against his professional obligations. It was one of the things that made him exceptional. He didn't just act on data. He considered the dimension of interpretation, the human layer behind the numbers. In another setting, under different circumstances, I might have sat with him for an hour and enjoyed the conversation. But not today. Not this Tuesday in November with the grey sky pressing down on West George Street and 17 days of careful preparation waiting to reach its next stage. I appreciate that. Marcus, I need you to do something for me. Can you hold off on reporting this for a few days? Keep it between us for now? He hesitated. I could see the conflict in his expression, the professional instinct pulling against the personal loyalty. Sir, company protocol requires... I know what protocol requires, I said gently. I wrote half of it. I just need a few days. I have reason to believe I know who this is, and I want to handle it in a way that protects the company as well as my family. Can you trust me on this? He studied my face for a moment, this careful, conscientious young man, and nodded. A few days, he said. Then I have to report regardless. That's all I need. I watched him fold the report closed, retuck it against his chest, and walk back toward the IT department with the slightly hunched posture of someone carrying something heavier than paper. I made a mental note to make sure his discretion was properly acknowledged when this was over. He deserved that. He'd handled an extraordinarily delicate situation with more maturity than most people twice his age would have managed, and he'd done it without ever being given the full picture of what he was handling. That matters. When people do the right thing without knowing the whole story, they deserve to be recognized for it. I walked back to my office, sat down behind my desk, looked out at the November sky over Glasgow pressing flat and pewter against the glass, and felt the quiet satisfaction of confirmation, not of the access itself. I'd known about that for 17 days. What I'd just confirmed was something else. Something about the nature of the trap I was building, and how neatly everything was falling into place. I opened my calendar. I had 4 meetings scheduled before noon. A review call with the Benelux distribution team, a budget sign-off with our financial controller, a catch-up with my opposite number in the Frankfurt office, and a brief with Gemma about the end-of-year logistics audit schedule. I moved through all 4 with the attention they deserved, each one receiving the same quality of focus I brought to any working day. If you had been in those meetings, you would not have known that I was simultaneously in the background of my mind, tracking the final approach of something I had been building for months. This is one of the things that people who don't work at a certain level of complexity sometimes don't understand. The capacity to hold multiple things at once, to operate on more than one layer simultaneously, is not a talent that's given. It's a discipline that's developed through years of professional experience, through the repeated practice of holding a large picture in mind while attending precisely to the detail immediately in front of you. I was very good at it. I had been doing it for most of my working life. Between the Frankfurt call and the budget sign-off, I gave myself 15 minutes and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Thomas Brennan, to confirm the arrangements we'd discussed the evening before were in place. The second was to Gemma, instructing her to send the message to Colin from my account, using the phrasing we had agreed, inviting him to the meeting he would now believe was the beginning of his consulting arrangement. Gemma did not ask questions. She sent the message and confirmed receipt within 3 minutes. She was, as always, impeccably professional, and I found myself grateful, not for the first time, that the people I worked most closely with were the people they were. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the hacking, or the beginning of the contempt, or even the beginning of my suspicion. Let me take you back further than that, to where this story really starts. To a Saturday afternoon in September 6 months ago, when I was sitting in Elena's mother's garden in Pollokshields with a glass of Rioja in my hand, watching the light move through the apple trees at the back of the lawn, and listening to Colin Hutchison explain to my brother-in-law David how cardiac research funding worked. "The thing is, mate," Colin was saying, leaning forward in his garden chair with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who has discovered they have an audience. The government grant structures are all wrong for innovation. What you need is private sector money, corporate partnerships. I've been telling clients for years the real money is in property, but healthcare investment is the next frontier. I could probably connect you with some people. David, who holds a dual fellowship in cardiology and electrophysiology, and whose most recent paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, listened with patient courtesy. He nodded. He asked a polite question. He was gracious, the way genuinely accomplished people often are, carrying their credentials lightly because they have nothing to prove. There was no performance in David's courtesy, no calculation. He simply had the settled quality of someone who had decided long ago that his energy was better spent on his work than on managing other people's perceptions of him. Colin had his full attention. I watched Colin sit up straighter. His voice got louder. His gestures expanded. Then Margaret, Elena's mother, called from the kitchen asking if anyone wanted more bread. And the moment broke, and Colin looked around the garden table, and his eyes landed on me. "Andrew," he said. "Still at Sterling, then?" It was the way he said it, not the words themselves. The words were harmless. It was the slight downward tilt at the end of the sentence. The way "still" carried the implication that staying somewhere for 19 years was a form of stagnation rather than commitment. The way Sterling then arrived with a kind of fond disappointment, as though he'd secretly hoped I'd have sorted myself out by now. "Still at Sterling," I confirmed pleasantly. "Must be nice," he said, reaching for a breadstick. "Stable job, regular hours. Benefits package. Not everyone can handle the pressure of running their own thing, you know. There's no shame in that." Colin did not run his own thing. Colin sold timeshare properties for a company called Prestige Gateway Resorts, which operated out of a serviced office in Tradeston and whose primary market was European retirees. He'd been with them for 4 years. Prior to that, he'd done double-glazing sales, then insurance, then something in financial services that I'd never quite understood the shape of. He rented a 1-bedroom flat in Mary Hill, which he spoke about with the casual authority of someone who'd chosen minimalism as a lifestyle rather than arrived at it by circumstance. I had a property portfolio valued at $7 million, 4 rental properties, 3 in the city and 1 in Ayrshire I'd bought before the market shifted, plus the Kelvin Grove flat where Eleanor and I had lived for 11 years. I'd built it steadily, reinvesting returns, using knowledge and timing, and the kind of patience that comes from genuinely understanding how money compounds over time. The Ayrshire property alone had nearly doubled in value since I'd bought it. The city rentals were managed by an agency who sent me quarterly statements that I filed without drama in a folder in the bottom drawer of my study desk. The irony of Colin's position was that he was, professionally, in the business of selling property investments. Prestige Gateway Resorts sold fractional ownership of holiday properties to retirees who paid annual maintenance fees that typically exceeded the value they received in return. It was the lowest end of the investment property market, constructed around the kind of selling that depends on people not fully understanding what they're buying. Colin had been doing it for 4 years and spoke about it with a fluency that might have impressed someone who didn't know the industry. I knew the industry. I had bought and sold more property with more sophistication in more markets than Colin would likely encounter in a full career. He had no idea. Colin thought I worked a corporate desk job and was one redundancy away from financial anxiety. I had let him think that for years. Why? Because Elena loved her brother, and I loved Elena. And because in those early years of our marriage, I genuinely tried to connect with Colin, tried to find common ground, tried to be the accommodating brother-in-law who didn't make Sunday dinners uncomfortable. I'd softened the edges of my achievements, deflected questions about work, changed the subject when conversations moved toward income or investment. It had been kindness initially, the kindness of not wanting anyone to feel diminished. But somewhere along the way, somewhere in the years of Sunday dinners and Christmas gatherings and birthday parties where Colin's comments had grown sharper and more confident, his assessments of me more sweeping and dismissive, I had stayed quiet, not out of kindness, but out of something else, out of a decision I hadn't consciously made, but was living nonetheless. Curiosity. I wanted to see how far it would go. I want to tell you now about a Thursday evening in early October because I think it tells you everything you need to know about what the next 6 weeks became. Elena and I had organized a small dinner at our flat on Kelvin Grove Park for our anniversary. Not a big occasion. 8 people, close friends, good wine, the kind of meal where the table stays loud until midnight because nobody wants the evening to end. Elena had made her mother's lamb recipe. I'd opened bottles I'd been saving. The flat was warm, the rain against the tall windows creating that particular enclosure that a Glasgow autumn evening can produce. The feeling of being sealed against the weather in a good room with people you'd chosen. Colin had arrived 35 minutes late, having been at what he described as a networking event in the city centre. He'd come in loud and warm, kissing Elena on the cheek, shaking hands around the table, landing in his chair with the expansive energy of someone who has been important somewhere else. He'd accepted a glass of the wine I'd opened without asking what it was. Halfway through the main course, our friend Stephen, who works as an architect, had asked me about the Munich expansion at Stirling. "I read something about it in the Herald," he said. "New distribution hub, right? That's yours?" It was mine. I'd been managing the project for 14 months, coordinating between logistics teams in 6 countries, navigating German planning regulations and cross-border supply chain agreements that had required more creative problem-solving than anything I'd managed in years. It was, if I'm honest, some of the best work of my career. The kind of work that wakes you at 5 a.m., not from anxiety, but from genuine engagement, your mind already turning over some problem that had been sitting at the back of it overnight, some solution assembling itself while you slept. "Ongoing," I said simply. "Still working through some of the logistics." "Must be a huge project," Stephen said. "Fairly significant," I agreed. Colin reached across the table for the wine. "It's basically administrative, isn't it?" he said, without looking up. "Moving boxes from one place to another, just with more paperwork. No offense, Andrew, but it's not exactly rocket science." The table had one of those sudden, brief silences where everyone hears something and isn't sure how to respond. I saw Stephen's hand pause on the table. I saw our friend Diane on my left glance at Elena across the table. I saw the tiny recalibration that passes through a dinner party when something has been said that lies just slightly outside what the occasion permits, when the social contract has been stretched without quite being broken, and everyone present is briefly uncertain whether the speaker knows this or doesn't. Elena's hand found mine under the table. I smiled. "No offense taken," I said. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Elena was loading the dishwasher, I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her face. She was quiet in that particular way that meant she was processing something. The way she moves through difficult emotional material, Elena does it like she does most things, with a kind of steady, unhurried attention that takes what's real on its own terms and doesn't dress it up into something easier. It is one of the things I have always loved most about her. "You could have said something," she said without turning around. "I know. He was rude." He was. "So why didn't you?" I thought about that for a moment. Why didn't I? Why had I been swallowing these moments for years? These small dismissals and casually aimed diminishments, these accumulating deposits of contempt that Colin made, with the confidence of someone who had never once considered being held accountable. The interesting thing about Colin's contempt was its quality of absolute certainty. There was no hesitation in it, no self-consciousness, no moment of checking whether it had landed wrong. He dispensed it the way people dispense pleasantries, automatically, without deliberation, from a settled position. "I'm interested in something," I said. "I'll explain later." Eleanor turned to look at me. She knew me well enough to know I wasn't being passive. She knew that tone. It was the tone I used in meetings when I'd already made a decision but was waiting for the room to arrive at it independently. "Andrew," she said slowly, "what are you doing?" "Nothing yet," I said, "but I think I might need to." 3 days later, Colin rang to ask if he could stay with us for a week. There was a business conference in the city centre, and with the cost of hotels being what they were, and us being family and all. His voice had its usual warmth when he asked, its practiced ease of someone making a request they've already decided will be granted, the performance of spontaneity over an underlying assumption. I heard in it everything he'd ever assumed about us, that we were comfortable but not notably wealthy, that we'd be pleased to have him, that the imposition was minor and the hospitality would flow naturally in his direction. Elena looked at me. I looked at Elena. "Of course," I said. This was the week it started. The first night of Colin's stay, I worked late in my study. I made sure the light was on when he went to bed, made sure he could hear the keys on my keyboard through the half-closed door. The second night, I made a point of working later, leaving my laptop open on the desk when I finally came to bed, and mentioning to Colin as I passed the sofa bed that I'd have to be up early to finish some reports. "Don't mind me, mate," Colin had said cheerfully. "I'm a heavy sleeper." He was not a heavy sleeper. I'd noticed this on previous stays. The way he'd appear in the kitchen, long before Elena and I did. The way sounds in the flat during the night would produce a quality of silence from the sofa bed that was different from sleep. He was a light sleeper who had learned to announce the opposite, the way people advertise the traits that serve their purposes. During the first 2 nights of his stay, I had maintained the performance of a man preoccupied with work and oblivious to the particulars of his domestic situation. I'd left my laptop on the desk with the screen on, displaying a document that looked important but was one of the fabricated files, a report on European distribution metrics that contained real-sounding data attached to nothing real. I'd made sure the door to the study was not fully closed. I'd left the lamp on the desk for the first night, then left it off on the second, as though I'd simply forgotten. Small calibrations, each one designed not to invite, but not to prevent. I was not enticing him. I was simply removing obstacles. A man like Colin, with the hunger he had, needed no enticement. He needed only the absence of deterrence. On the second night, at 1:30 in the morning, I heard him move from the sofa bed. The flat has old wooden floors that carry sound, and I had been lying awake in the dark with the particular lightness of a man who is not trying to sleep but is resting in the expectation of information. I heard his footsteps cross the living room. I heard the slight creak of the study door being pushed open slowly. I heard nothing after that, which meant he was standing in the study's doorway, looking, deciding. Then the door creaked closed again, and his footsteps returned to the living room. Not yet. He needed another night. He needed to convince himself that the opportunity was real and that the risk was manageable. That is how these decisions are made. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of reassurances, the steady building of confidence that finally tips into action. The third morning, I woke at 4 a.m. and checked my monitoring logs. There it was, the first access event. 3:14 a.m., my laptop, local network. 11 minutes of activity. I lay in the dark beside Elena and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more precise than anger. recognition, the quiet click of a pattern confirming itself, the feeling you get when data you've been accumulating finally coheres into a shape that was always there, but needed one more point to become undeniable. I've felt it before, in professional contexts, when months of security analysis suddenly crystallizes around a vulnerability. I've felt it in negotiations, when the shape of the other party's position becomes clear in a single exchange. The feeling is not pleasant, exactly, but it is, in its way, satisfying. I want you to understand what I'd built before Colin ever touched that keyboard. In the weeks prior, when the feeling in my gut had first started, when I'd noticed Colin's eyes lingering a beat too long on my laptop bag, on the papers on my desk, on the small framed document on my study wall that noted a commendation from the Sterling board, I had begun to prepare. I'd installed custom monitoring firmware on my home router, passive logging, invisible to any standard network scan. I'd created a secondary surveillance layer on the laptop itself, a kernel-level process that recorded every input, every access attempt, every file opened, with timestamps accurate to the second. I'd built a sandboxed mirror drive and loaded it with plausible-looking but entirely fabricated corporate documents, projected budgets with slightly wrong numbers, strategy documents that referenced real initiatives but included dead-end details, a folder labeled Personal Investment Portfolio that showed reasonable but unremarkable figures. Everything Colin would find if he looked was designed to satisfy curiosity without providing anything genuinely useful, and everything Colin touched would be recorded. The fabrication required a particular kind of craft, not just the technical construction of files that looked authentic, but the human calibration. What would a man like Colin, with his specific understanding of corporate structures, find credible? What numbers would feel real to someone who had never worked inside a company at this level? What document names would carry the right weight of secrecy without triggering obvious suspicion? I thought about these questions the way I thought about any design problem, from the perspective of the person who would encounter it. I imagined myself as Colin, sitting in the dark in front of a screen at 3 a.m, tired and slightly nervous, and very, very curious, looking for confirmation of things he already half believed. I made the files for that person. I made them precisely enough to be convincing and loosely enough to be incomplete. Enough to give him something to run with, but never enough to give him anything real. The camera went in on day 4. A small wireless unit, no larger than a 50-pence piece, seated in the spine of a reference book on the shelf above my desk. I positioned it to capture the desk and laptop screen clearly. Colin never looked up when he entered the study. He was too focused on the laptop. By the end of his stay, I had 4 separate access events logged, each one between 3 and 4 a.m., each one lasting between 9 and 18 minutes. He was careful, I'll give him that. He didn't take long. He knew he was in unfamiliar territory. What he didn't know was that I could see every single thing he opened. He spent most of his time in my documents folder. He opened the fabricated strategy files. He opened the fake portfolio. He opened a folder I'd labeled Confidential VP Promotion Package, Do Not Share, which I'd seeded with carefully constructed details about a fictional senior vice president position, salary of $280, $280, company car, discretionary annual bonus up to $95. All of it was completely fabricated, not a single real number, not a single real opportunity, but real enough to be believable. Real enough for a man who didn't understand the inside of corporate structures to take at face value. I'd drawn on 20 years of corporate experience to make the fiction feel textured and specific, the right formatting conventions, the right level of vagueness in the language, the right mix of confidence and hedging that characterizes internal documents. The kind of detail that someone inside an organization would find unremarkable, and someone outside would find overwhelmingly convincing. I watched him open that folder 3 times across his stay. 3 times. He came back to it the way you come back to something you want to be certain about before you act on it. The 3rd time was on the final night of his stay at 3:47 a.m. He was in the folder for 14 minutes, long enough to have read it carefully, long enough to have noted figures, maybe photographed the screen, maybe copied what he needed into some private document of his own, long enough to have satisfied himself that what he'd found was real. After Colin left, the remote access continued. He'd taken note of something during his time in my study, something that let him back in from his own flat in Mary Hill. The access shifted from local network to remote, still arriving between 3 and 4 a.m., still navigating the same folders. He was building a picture, I realized. He was assembling information toward something. This is when Marcus found it, flagged it, and came to me pale-faced in the corridor outside conference room 3. And this is when I began the second phase. Because accessing my computer was one thing, what I needed to know was what Colin intended to do with what he thought he'd found. This required a different kind of patience, the kind that means letting someone walk down a path you've built, knowing exactly where it ends. I started asking Colin's opinion on things, deliberately, strategically. Casual phone calls where I mentioned a work situation and asked what he'd do. Messages asking his advice on a client relationship. At Sunday dinner at Margaret's house in Pollokshields, I deferred to him in conversation, sought his counsel, expressed uncertainty about decisions I'd already made with complete confidence. I asked his opinion on a presentation I was preparing. Though no such presentation existed, I forwarded him an article about European logistics trends, with a note asking what he thought the implications were for companies like Sterling. He replied within the hour with a paragraph that demonstrated in its confident wrongness that he understood neither the article nor the industry it described. I saved the reply. I saved everything. The phone calls became a particular study in human behavior. When I asked Colin's advice, something in his voice changed within the first few exchanges. It deepened slightly. The pace of his speech slowed from the quick-fire salesman's rhythm into something more deliberate, more considered, the vocal register of a man who is taking his own counsel seriously. He began to qualify his advice with phrases like, "from my perspective in the real world," and having dealt with these kinds of decisions firsthand. He referenced past clients and past deals, situations I had no way to verify, in which his guidance had apparently proved decisive. The stories were always just vague enough to resist scrutiny. I listened to all of them with the same attentive interest, asking follow-up questions that were designed to encourage rather than probe, feeding the performance without ever fully believing it. What I was watching, I understood, was a man discovering for what felt to him like the first time that he was valued, that his thinking mattered, that someone he had long considered beneath him was actively seeking his guidance. The warmth of that discovery was visible in everything. His tone, his availability, the speed of his replies, the increasing length of his messages. It is a lonely thing to spend years telling yourself you are more capable than the people around you and finding no one to confirm it. The world, in its practical operation, had not been confirming Colin's assessment of himself. His career had moved sideways rather than upward. His social circle was comfortable, but not admiring. His relationships were cordial, but not deferential. He had spent years in the company of people who treated him as an equal at best, which in his private accounting amounted to a kind of constant, low-grade failure of recognition. And then I had appeared, asking for his guidance, and the recognition had arrived at last. You have to understand how this felt. Not to me, to Colin. When you have been telling yourself for years that someone is less than you, that their success is administrative, and their salary is corporate luck, and their marriage is above their station, you develop a kind of hunger for confirmation. You want the person to behave as you've cast them. You want them to need you. It validates every assessment you've made. Colin rose to it like a fish to a hook. He called more often. His texts became warmer, more advisory, more paternal. He sent me articles about leadership that he thought I might find useful. He offered to come by and talk me through some strategic thinking before a board presentation I'd mentioned. He began referring to himself in conversation as someone who understood the real world of business in a way that career corporates simply didn't. He used the phrase real world often, real world experience, real world perspective, real world thinking. In Colin's taxonomy, the real world was the place outside companies like Sterling, the place where men like him operated, and corporate careers like mine were a kind of gilded shelter from its rigors. I let him expand. I let him grow confident. And I noticed, with some precision, the change in the texture of our interactions as his certainty increased. He interrupted less because he had become the one explaining. He listened more because he was enjoying being listened to. He was, I recognized, performing for an audience he finally believed he had, and that performance was telling me everything. I watched Elena's face at Sunday dinner as Colin explained to me, at considerable length, how supply chain optimization really worked, and I saw the exact moment she understood what I was doing. Her expression didn't change. She reached for her glass, but her eyes found mine across the table for just a fraction of a second, and what passed between us in that fraction was a whole conversation. You're watching him. Yes, and you see it, don't you? Every bit of it. We didn't discuss it. We didn't need to. Ilana is the kind of woman who has always understood me at a register below language, which is among the reasons I have been grateful for her for more than 2 decades. She didn't signal approval, exactly. She didn't nod or give me a look that said, "Carry on." She simply looked at me with the clear, level gaze of someone who understands a situation fully and has decided to trust the person managing it. That trust is not a small thing. It requires a particular kind of confidence in another person's judgment and a particular kind of security in your own to stand beside someone in the dark and not reach for the light switch. The other person who began to see it was Margaret. Elena's mother is 67. She has the quality some people develop in older age of seeing through performance to the person beneath it, the way certain kinds of light cut through water and illuminate the bottom with a clarity that softer light can't achieve. She'd raised Colin. She knew his patterns. She'd watched him for 38 years do what he was now doing to me, and I think somewhere in her, beneath the loyalty of a mother, there was the private acknowledgement of something she'd hoped he'd grown past. Margaret was a woman who had built a life from careful observation. She'd been a teacher for 30 years, secondary school English, the kind of teacher who remembered every student she'd ever taught, not because she was sentimental, but because she genuinely paid attention. She'd raised 2 children largely on her own after her husband's death, and she'd done it with a practicality and warmth that Elena had inherited in equal measure. She was not given to drama or confrontation, but she was given to honesty in the quietest and most unshakable of ways, and that honesty was, I think, what made Colin uncomfortable around her, even as he performed ease and affection at her table every Sunday. I noticed her watching Colin at the dinner table, the way her expression would shift slightly when he spoke over me or dismissed something I'd said, the way she'd glance at me afterward, briefly, with something in her eyes that might have been apology. Then, one Sunday, 3 weeks before the catalyst, she spoke. "Colin," she said, in a pause between his explanation of why I probably shouldn't try to manage the Munich project without external consultants. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Why do you always speak to Andrew like that?" The table went still in that particular way that happens when something real enters the conversation. Colin laughed. It was practiced, warm, deflecting. "It's just banter, Mum. Andrew knows I'm joking. Don't you, mate? I nodded obligingly, smiled. The mask I'd been wearing for months didn't so much as flicker, but Margaret's gaze stayed on me, not with pity, with a kind of searching concern, the concern of someone who sees something they want to name, but isn't sure if naming it will help. She was not asking me whether I was hurt. She was asking me whether I wanted her to continue, whether the naming of this was something that would serve me, or something I was managing already in my own way. She was, without knowing it, asking the right question. "It doesn't sound like joking," she said finally. Colin moved on, changed the subject with practiced smoothness, but for the rest of that dinner he was slightly quieter, slightly less expansive, and the dynamic had shifted by a few degrees. The mask was cracking, not mine. His. I drove home that evening thinking about Margaret, about what it costs a parent to see a child clearly, about the particular courage required to say out loud in a family setting, in front of food and wine and carefully maintained civility, that something is wrong. She'd done it gently. She'd done it in a way that gave Colin every opportunity to recalibrate, to hear himself, to choose differently. She'd offered him the chance to be embarrassed and emerge better from it, which is the most a loving person can offer another. He hadn't, but she'd tried. I want to tell you about the Wednesday that changed everything, because every story like this has a Wednesday, a specific day when the abstract finally becomes concrete, when what you've suspected stops being suspicion and becomes reality, and the full shape of what you're dealing with comes into clear and undeniable focus. It was a Wednesday in late October. I was at my desk on the third floor of Sterling Dynamics, working through the quarterly variance reports for our Benelux operations, when Gemma, my assistant, appeared in my office doorway with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, somewhere between confusion and apology. Gemma had been my assistant for 4 years. She was efficient, perceptive, and possessed of the particular talent, invaluable in someone who works closely with you, of reading the emotional temperature of any situation quickly and accurately. She'd met Colin twice at Sterling events, and on both occasions I'd noticed her perform a small, careful recalibration in her manner when she understood he was my brother-in-law, the slight softening of her professional neutrality into something warmer, the extra effort to be welcoming. She was, in essence, someone who tried to see the best in people, which made the expression on her face that morning more telling than it might have been on a more guarded person. "Your brother-in-law is here," she said. "Colin Hutchison. He walked past reception. He says he needs to see you urgently." I kept my expression neutral. "Send him in." The Colin came through my office door with the confident stride of someone who has crossed into territory they believe they've already conquered. He closed the door behind him without asking. He looked around the office the way people do when they're calibrating how to position themselves, taking in the framed photographs on the wall, the view of the city behind me, the quiet evidence of seniority that lives in the texture of a space. His eyes lingered a moment on my screen, which was displaying the Munich projections. I minimized the window. Old habit, deep conditioning now. He sat in the chair across from my desk without being invited. "We need to talk, Andrew," he said. "Colin, this isn't really a great time. I have a call in." "I know about the promotion," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside my window, the sound of West George Street, traffic, November wind, the low rhythm of the city. I waited. I have learned over a long career that silence at the right moment is worth 3 times any question you might ask, because it lets the other person fill the space with exactly what's driving them. If you're patient enough to stay quiet, people will tell you things they didn't intend to tell you. They'll confirm things you were only guessing. They'll reveal the shape of their hand before the bet has been placed. "The SVP package," Colin continued, leaning forward slightly with the confidence of someone playing what they believe is a strong hand. "The salary, The bonus structure. I know what's in the file. He said it watching my face. He said it waiting for the reaction of someone caught off guard. I gave him that reaction. I let my expression shift to something close to concern. My hands, resting on my desk, tightened slightly. "That file is confidential, Colin," I said carefully. "I know." He said it without apology, which told me everything about where this conversation was going. Not defensive, not cautious, simply noting a fact, the way someone notes a fact they've decided no longer needs to carry any weight. "Then how does it matter?" He waved a hand. "The point is, Andrew, I'm not sure Elena knows how significant this is, and I'm not sure you do either." He paused, letting this land. Then he leaned back in the chair, crossed one ankle over his knee, and looked at me with what I can only describe as studied generosity, the magnanimity of a man who is about to do you a very expensive favor. "I've been thinking about this," he said. "I've been thinking about you, honestly. You've been at Sterling a long time. You know these people. You know the systems. But this SVP level, Andrew, this is a different game. And between us, man to man, I'm not sure you're ready for it. That's a lot of responsibility for someone at your level of experience." 19 years. I had been with Sterling Dynamics for 19 years. I had hired 47 people, managed 8 office relocations, increased European operational efficiency by 34%, and overseen a cumulative logistics budget of more than $2 billion. I held 2 advanced degrees, one in logistics management and one in network systems architecture. My most recent performance review had used the word exceptional 7 times. But I had let Colin Hutchison believe I was a man who struggled with responsibility, and now he was sitting in my office offering to help. "What I'm thinking," Colin continued, "is that you need someone who can provide strategic support, real strategic thinking, not just operational management. I could position myself as a consultant, come in ahead of the promotion process, help them see you in the right light." He paused. "Obviously, there would need to be some arrangement. In terms of compensation, I'd be doing the real thinking. After all, the positioning, the political work, 40% of the bonus package seems fair, given the value I'd be adding." I looked at him. I studied his face, the ease with which he sat in my chair, in my office, in my building, asking me to give him $38 of a bonus from a job that didn't exist, based on information he'd stolen from my laptop in the middle of the night while I was asleep. I let the silence stretch for a moment, not uncomfortably, just long enough to let it have a shape of its own. And then he said it. The thing that took this from audacious to something else entirely. The thing I have turned over in my mind many times since, not with anger, but with a kind of wondering clarity, the way you examine a specimen under light. "You're not VP material, Andrew." He said it simply, matter-of-factly, as though he were describing the weather or stating an obvious feature of the landscape. "You're barely manager material, but I can make them think you are, and that's worth at least 40% of your bonus, don't you think?" There it was, 19 years, 2 degrees, 14 countries, 340 employees. A portfolio built from the ground up, from nothing, from careful reading and early mornings and decisions made with precision over 2 decades. And Colin Hutchison, who sold timeshares from a serviced office in Tradeston, who had never managed a budget above 5 figures, who rented a flat in Maryhill and drove a 9-year-old Vauxhall, was sitting in the chair across from me, telling me I was barely manager material. "You're not VP material. You're barely manager material." I have replayed those words many times, and each time what strikes me is not the contempt in them, but the confidence, the absolute, unexamined certainty. He had assembled a picture of me from years of watching what I allowed him to see, a picture of a man who was affable and quiet and comfortable, and perhaps a little slow. A man who needed guiding and managing and support. A man who was grateful for his cushy corporate job and knew better than to reach above his station, and he had believed it completely. Because I had been very good at showing him exactly what I wanted him to see. What struck me most, sitting across from him in that moment, was the absence of any second-guessing in him, the complete non-appearance of doubt. He had walked into the office of a man he intended to extort, and he had done it with the ease of someone dropping in for a social visit. He had said the words, "You're not VP material," to a man who was sitting in the VP's chair in the VP's office, and he had said them without irony and without hesitation. That requires a particular quality of certainty about the world and your place in it, the unquestioned conviction that your read of a situation is the correct one. It is the quality of a man who has never been shown. In terms he could not dismiss that he was wrong. "Let me think about it," I said. His face relaxed into satisfaction. He stood, patted my shoulder once, the way you pat a dog who has learned the trick correctly. "Don't think too long, mate. These windows close, and you're not getting any younger." He was 38. I was 52. He left. I sat in my office for 10 minutes after he walked out. I didn't move. I looked at my screen, at the city outside the window, at the framed photograph on my wall that Eleanor had given me on our 10th anniversary, taken on the steps of our Kelvin Grove flat in summer light, both of us laughing at something one of the photographers had said. I looked at that photograph for a long time. There is something clarifying about looking at a photograph of a moment of uncomplicated joy when you've just sat through a moment of something more complex. It reminds you of the scale of things, of what is actually important and what is merely, in the long run, an episode. I had everything I needed, every access event, camera footage, a recorded conversation, 23 documented intrusions. A proposal for fraud, stated plainly and on record, in my own office, in the presence of technology that had been running silently for weeks. Then I picked up my phone and called Thomas Brennan, Director of Corporate Security. "Thomas," I said, "I need conference room C tomorrow morning, and I need Rebecca Chen." There was a pause. Thomas had worked with me for 11 years. He knew the sound of my voice in different registers. He'd heard it in the middle of major operational crises, in the aftermath of security breaches, in the measured exchanges of difficult performance reviews, and even more difficult negotiations. He had a precise ear for the difference between voices, a calibrated sensitivity to what a tone implied. "What have we got?" he asked carefully. "Corporate espionage," I said, "and attempted fraud. I have 23 documented access events, camera footage, and a conversation recorded in this office in the last 30 minutes. Another pause, shorter. "I'll call Rebecca now," Thomas said. "That was yesterday. Today is Thursday. It is 10:47 a.m. I am sitting in Thomas Brennan's office, 3 doors down from conference room C, watching a live conference link on Thomas's monitor. The image is sharp, the sound clear, the angle showing the full table and both occupants with the casual neutrality of a security camera. Thomas's office is a room I've sat in many times over 11 years, but I see it differently this morning. The framed certifications on the wall, the neat arrangement of files on the credenza behind his desk, the single personal photograph, his daughter's graduation, on the corner shelf. It is the office of a man who takes his work seriously and keeps his private life separate from it, who has created a professional space that reflects the principles he brings to his work: order, documentation, accountability. I've always respected the tidiness of Thomas's mind. This morning, the tidiness is delivering something I've been building toward for months, and the gratitude I feel for it is unexpectedly strong. Colin Hutchison arrived at Sterling Dynamics 17 minutes ago. He had been told, via a message sent from my assistant Gemma on my instruction, that there was a meeting to discuss preliminary arrangements for the consulting engagement. He had come in from the street, through reception, up to the third floor, and into conference room C with the stride of a man who is arriving for negotiations he intends to win. He is wearing his better suit, the navy one he brings out for occasions he considers important. He is sitting across from Rebecca Chen, Sterling's chief legal counsel, and Thomas Brennan, who nodded at me in the corridor before taking his seat in the room. Colin looked around when he arrived, expecting to see me. He didn't. He sat down, looked at Rebecca, looked at Thomas, and the first trace of something not entirely comfortable moved across his face. I watch from the monitor as Rebecca opens her folder with a precise, unhurried movement. She is 51 years old, a senior advocate before she moved in-house, and she has the particular quality of stillness that comes from years of watching people across tables in high-stakes environments. She shows nothing. She is the most controlled person in any room she occupies. I have watched her in a dozen high-pressure situations, and she has never, not once, betrayed impatience, discomfort, or anything other than an absolute clarity of purpose. She is precisely the right person for this meeting, and I told Thomas so when I asked for her. "Mr. Hutchison," she says, "thank you for coming in." "Happy to help," Colin says, and his voice has its professional warmth, its salesman's ease. I think we're all going to be pleased with how this arrangement works out. Before we begin, Rebecca says, "I need to ask you a few questions. Are you comfortable with that?" "Of course." He spreads his hands, confident. "Are you aware that unauthorized access to computer systems is a criminal offense under the Computer Misuse Act 1990? The change in Colin's face is not dramatic. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It's more like watching a tide go out. A slow withdrawal of color and ease, and the performance of casual control, drawn back by a question that arrives from the wrong direction, from outside the script he'd prepared, from a dimension he hadn't considered. "I'm sorry," he says. "The Computer Misuse Act," Rebecca repeats with the same calm. "Unauthorized access to computer material. Are you familiar with the legislation?" "I don't see what that has to do with—" Thomas slides a document across the table. It's the access log. 23 entries, timestamps, IP addresses, duration, presented in the way that only genuinely precise security documentation can be presented. Clear, objective, undeniable. Each entry is dated, timed to the second, annotated with the device identifier and the network path. It is the kind of document that has no interpretation. It simply is what it is, and what it is a complete record of every choice Colin made over the past several weeks, rendered in permanent, irrefutable form. We have logs showing 23 unauthorized access events from your sister's residential IP address, Thomas says. His voice is even. The device accessed was a corporate laptop registered to Andrew Sutherland, Vice President of European Operations. The files accessed were classified under Sterling Dynamics' internal security protocols. Colin looks at the log. He looks at it for a long time. When he looks up, his voice has changed. It's lost the salesman's register. It's tighter, more careful. "Andrew is my brother-in-law. I was staying with them. He had his laptop in the study, and I needed to—" "Mr. Sutherland has provided a sworn statement confirming that he gave you no permission to access his device," Rebecca says. "That statement is notarized. He's my family. This is a family matter, not a—" "Furthermore," Thomas says, "we have security footage from a camera in Mr. Sutherland's home study." The silence that follows is a specific kind of silence. The kind that happens when someone who believed they had complete control over a situation discovers that control was always imagined. I have watched people realize things across a table before. I've watched negotiations turn. I've watched deals collapse. But I have rarely watched a person realize, in real time, the precise and total shape of how wrong they were. It is not a comfortable thing to watch, even when the person is someone who has earned the watching. There is something fundamentally human about the moment of exposure, the stripping away of the constructed self that produces in me not satisfaction, but a kind of neutral recognition. He didn't know the camera was there. He didn't know any of it was there. He moved through what he believed was his private opportunity, and every step of his private opportunity was observed. Colin sits in conference room C with his navy suit and his polished shoes and his professional warmth drained entirely out of him, and he looks like a man standing on ground that has turned to water. The camera, Rebecca continues, clearly shows you accessing Mr. Sutherland's laptop on 4 separate occasions during your stay at the property, between the hours of 3 and 4 a.m. It shows you accessing the device while Mr. and Mrs. Sutherland were asleep. I can explain. Additionally, Rebecca says, and there is something in her voice, not unkindness exactly, but a kind of exact and final precision. The voice of someone who has said this kind of thing many times before and has no interest in softening it. Your visit to this office yesterday and the conversation you had with Mr. Sutherland in which you requested 40% of a bonus package in exchange for consulting services has been recorded. Colin's hands are on the table. They look wrong suddenly, too large, not sure where to be. That was a private conversation, he says. Andrew is family. Under the Fraud Act 2006, Rebecca says, obtaining or attempting to obtain financial gain through false representation or abuse of position constitutes fraud. You represented yourself as capable of providing strategic services essential to Mr. Sutherland's career advancement. You leveraged information obtained through unauthorized access to his personal device to construct a situation of false dependency. You requested financial compensation for services that were neither requested nor necessary. I was helping him, Colin says, and his voice rises slightly, the beginning of the defensive climb. Andrew is completely out of his depth in that role. Everyone can see it. I was trying to... Thomas leans forward. In 11 years working with Thomas Brennan, I have seen him lean forward in that particular way exactly 4 times. It is the gesture of a man who has reached the end of his patience with a particular fiction and has decided to stop accommodating it. Each time I've seen it, it has preceded something precise and irrevocable. The room, even through a monitor, seems to shift slightly in temperature. Mr. Sutherland has been with this company for 19 years, Thomas says. He holds 2 advanced degrees in logistics management and network systems architecture. He has managed European operations through 3 economic downturns, overseen 6 office expansions, and increased this division's operational efficiency by 34%. His performance reviews are, without exception, ranked in the highest category. I am genuinely uncertain where you've formed your assessment of his competence, Mr. Hutchison, but I can tell you with complete authority that it does not align with the reality of his record at this company. In Thomas's office, watching the screen, I feel something move through my chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not yet. Something quieter and more complex than either. The feeling of a truth spoken plainly by someone with no stake in it, by someone who is simply reporting fact, and the particular quality of that plainness, the way it sounds so different from the elaborate, careful justifications we offer for ourselves. 19 years, 2 degrees, 34%, heard out loud in a corporate conference room, by a woman who needs no emotion to deliver it, by a man who has observed it close enough to call it without hesitation. It is, I realize in this moment, the first time in years that anyone has said any of this in a room where Colin could hear it. There is something almost painful about it, actually, not in the way pain usually arrives, with heat and urgency, but in the way that a long-held breath releasing feels painful at the edges. the moment of return from something that has been held too long. 19 years. The facts of those years had existed continuously, had been lived through and documented and reviewed and built upon, but they had existed in a space that Colin's certainty had never entered. He'd constructed his version of me in that certainty, and it had lived there undisturbed, because I had chosen not to disturb it, until now. Until Thomas Brennan, in a conference room on West George Street on a November Thursday, read the record aloud. On the monitor, Colin's hands are still now. He is looking at the table. He is not the man who walked into this building 17 minutes ago. Sterling Dynamics is prepared to refer this matter to Police Scotland, Rebecca says. She does not pause. She does not wait for his reaction. She simply continues, the way water continues, finding the path already clear. Given the documented evidence of unauthorized computer access, violations of the Computer Misuse Act, and the attempted fraud, Police Scotland would be presented with a case that carries a maximum sentence of 2 years under the former and up to 10 years under the latter. Colin's head comes up. 10 years, he says. It's barely a word. It's more like a sound he's made without deciding to. However, Rebecca continues, and here she slides a document across the table. Mr. Sutherland has requested that we offer you an alternative. The document is 3 pages, clean, formal, prepared by Rebecca's team yesterday afternoon. I'd been involved in drafting it, though the legal language was entirely Rebecca's. I'd wanted it to be thorough. Every clause had a purpose. Every requirement had been calibrated not to punish, but to protect, to create the conditions in which this situation could be resolved in a way that left everyone able to continue with their lives. Colin reaches for it with hands that are no longer entirely steady. You will sign a full written confession acknowledging unauthorized access to Mr. Sutherland's computer systems on 23 documented occasions. You will confirm that you were not given permission for such access and that the files you viewed were classified corporate property. Colin turns the page. You will agree to cease all unsolicited contact with Mr. Sutherland outside of mandatory family events, which Mr. Sutherland may decline at his discretion. You will not attend any Sterling Dynamics premises or contact any Sterling Dynamics employees regarding matters pertaining to Mr. Sutherland's professional role. He turns the page again. You will seek employment outside of the Glasgow City region for a minimum period of 2 years from the date of this agreement, ensuring a period of geographic separation conducive to the resolution of this matter. There is a paragraph after this one. Colin reads it, and I watch the moment it lands. You will repay the sum of £3,400, Rebecca says, representing meals, accommodation and personal loans provided by Mr. and Mrs. Sutherland over the 14-month period preceding this agreement, for which repayment was agreed but not made. I had kept everything, every restaurant receipt from the Sunday dinners at Merchant City where Colin had arrived claiming he'd forgotten his wallet, every grocery run for the weeks he'd stayed with us, the $800 for the car repair in February, the $300 for the insurance gap in July, the smaller sums, the $40 here and the $60 there, that had accumulated with the quiet patience of a man who notices everything and writes things down. I have always written things down. It is a habit that begins, I think, in the first job where you are responsible for something large enough to matter. The discipline of documentation, of creating a record that does not depend on memory or perception, that exists independently of how either party might later choose to characterize what happened. I had applied that discipline to my professional life for decades. Somewhere in the drift of years of Sunday dinners and borrowed wallets and favors offered with the assumption of return, I had applied it to this too. Total, $3,400. 14 months, documented to the penny. Colin puts the document down on the table. He looks at Thomas. He looks at Rebecca. He looks around the room at the absence of me. And his face does something complicated, something I can only describe as the expression of a man who has been playing a character for years and has just realized the character was a lie and has no idea who he is beneath it. "If you refuse to sign," Rebecca says, "we proceed with the Police Scotland referral within 24 hours. The room is very quiet. "I want to speak to Andrew," Colin says. "Mr. Sutherland is not available to speak with you at this time," Rebecca says. "This isn't fair," Colin whispers. He says it quietly, to no one in particular. He says it looking at the table, not at Rebecca. Not at Thomas, not at the camera above the door that is pointed directly at him, recording everything, the way the camera in my study recorded everything, the way everything in this story has been recorded and logged and documented by a man who spent 12 years building systems designed to see exactly what is there. This isn't fair. And I sit in Thomas's office 3 doors down, watching the feed, and I think about what fair looks like. I think about years of Sunday dinners, of politely swallowed dismissals, of Elena's hand finding mine under the table. I think about the wedding 13 years ago where Colin told our mutual friends that Elena had married below her station. I think about every performance review of mine that contained the word exceptional and that nobody in this story except Sterling Dynamics knew about, because I had never found a way to say it that didn't feel like shouting. I think about what fair looks like when it finally arrives. It doesn't look like thunder. It looks like a document across a table. It looks like a log of 23 access events. It looks like a camera in a reference book and a sworn statement and 11 years of performance reviews handed to a man who was told with evidence that his assessment was wrong. It is quiet. It is exact. It is, I think, fair. Colin signs the document. I watch him do it. I watch his hand move across the signature line, and there is no pleasure in it, not the sharp electric pleasure that anger produces when it finds its outlet, but something lower and more lasting than that. Something closer to what I imagine archaeologists feel when they finally reach the artifact they have been excavating for months. The confirmation that what they suspected was there was there. He signs. Thomas countersigns as witness. Rebecca countersigns as counsel. Copies are distributed. Colin Hutchison sits in conference room C at Sterling Dynamics in his good Navy suit, with his signed confession in front of him and his debt acknowledged in writing, and the city of Glasgow November grey outside the window, and he looks like a man who arrived this morning as the version of himself he had always believed he was, and will leave as someone else. He stands, he shakes no one's hand, he walks out. I watch him go through the glass corridor on the monitor, past the framed photographs of container ships, past the coffee station, past the reception desk where Paul from procurement looks up briefly, and out through the front doors onto West George Street, into the November air. I sit in Thomas's office for a while longer. There is a quality to the silence after something like this. Not emptiness, more like the silence of a room after a piece of music has ended, when the sound is gone, but its resonance is still present in the air, still faintly there in the walls and the ceiling and the people who were listening. I sit in that silence and let it have its moment. Thomas comes back in 10 minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee and puts one on the desk beside me without saying anything. We are quiet together for a moment. 19 years, Thomas says finally, and he thought you were out of your depth. He saw what I let him see, I said. Thomas picked up his mug, considered this. That's a particular kind of patience, he said. It's a particular kind of curiosity, I said. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that means someone is working through a thought rather than simply pausing. The fabricated files, he said. The fake promotion package. That's not just patience, that's something else. It's preparation, I said. Patience is waiting. What I did was more specific than waiting. I built the conditions under which the thing I suspected could either confirm or refute itself. I needed to know if my read was right. I needed to see what he'd actually do if he thought he had leverage. A man like Colin, given what he thought he had, would either sit on it indefinitely out of uncertainty, or he'd move. And the way he moved would tell me everything I needed to know about what we were actually dealing with. Thomas looked at me over his mug. And he moved, I said, faster than I expected, actually. You're not surprised? No, he nodded again. Outside, the November sky was doing the thing Glasgow skies do in November, pressing low and close over the buildings. Not raining, but very close to it. The light flat and white and entirely honest about what time of year it is. "How's Elena?" he asked. "I'm going to tell her everything tonight," I said. "She deserves the full story." That evening I drove home through Glasgow in the early dark, past the lights of Sauchiehall Street and through the park gates, up to the Kelvin Grove flat, where the windows were lit warm yellow from inside, and I could smell Elena's cooking from the stairwell. And I stood for a moment in the entrance of my own building in the November cold and breathed. I do this sometimes, this standing before the threshold of the home, this taking a breath before going inside, not from reluctance, from something closer to ritual, a deliberate separation between the day outside and the life within the door, a moment of acknowledging the distinction. We had built this flat over 11 years into something that was entirely ours, full of the specific archaeology of two people's choices accumulated over decades, the books we'd read and kept, the art we'd accumulated, the particular way the furniture had arranged itself over time into the positions that felt right. I love that flat. I love its windows onto the park, the way the light changes across the living room through the day, the sounds of the city reaching us muffled and distant at the top of the building. I love that it is ours, in the truest sense, built not from one decision, but from thousands. Inside, I told Elena everything, beginning to end, the monitoring firmware, the sandboxed files, Marcus in the corridor, the fabricated promotion package, the camera, Wednesday's conversation, today's meeting, the signed confession, the 400. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she didn't drink, and she listened. Her expression moved through things I couldn't always name. Surprise, which faded quickly into the look of someone whose half-formed suspicions are being confirmed, something that might have been relief, something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it, the slow burn version that comes not from shock, but from recognition, the anger of someone who has been suspecting something for some time and has just been handed the shape of the thing entire. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at her wineglass. She turned it slightly in her fingers. I have watched Elena think many times. It is one of the things I find most extraordinary about her, the quality of her attention when she is genuinely processing something. She is not performing consideration. She is actually considering. There is a difference that is subtle, but entirely visible to someone who has watched her long enough. "How long?" she said. "Since October," I said. "The monitoring, longer, the full picture, since he came to my office on Wednesday." "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" I thought about this. "Because you would have wanted to intervene," I said. "And I needed to see what he'd do without intervention. I needed to know the actual size of it." She looked at me for a long time. Elena, who has known me for more than 20 years, who has watched me move through rooms with the quiet self-containment of a man who has decided what he is and doesn't need others to confirm it, who has put her hand in mine under 100 dinner tables when her brother's contempt found its mark. Eleanor, who never once told me I should fight back, but who always knew I was capable of it. "And now you know," she said. "Now I know," I said. She picked up her wineglass finally and took a sip. "The £3,400, she said. "You kept receipts." "I kept everything." The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, the particular expression of a woman who has been patient for a long time and has just been shown that her patience was not, as she sometimes feared, indistinguishable from acceptance. There is a quality to that expression that I lack the words to describe fully, except to say that it is one of the things I love most in her face, the way it speaks to something she does not need to articulate, the visible evidence of a woman who is finally completely understood by the moment she is living in. "Good," she said. That night Colin called her. She took the call in the living room, and I stayed in the kitchen washing up, listening to the low murmur of her voice without trying to make out the words. I didn't need to hear it. I knew what was happening. I'd known this would come. There was no version of this day that didn't end with that call. Colin, whatever else he was not someone who accepted the loss of a position without attempting to regain it through the nearest available channel. Elena was that channel. She was his sister, and he had relied on her forgiveness often and deeply over the years, in ways that she had never fully articulated to me, but that I had understood from the shape of the silences that followed certain phone calls. After 30 minutes, Eleanor came back into the kitchen. She set her phone on the counter and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "He's crying," she said. "I expected that," I said. "He says it was a misunderstanding. He says you set him up. He says he was only trying to help. What did you say?" She turned to look at me. "I said, Colin, you called my husband useless. You stole from him. You tried to blackmail him in his own office. You've been insulting him at family dinners for years, and you've been doing it in front of me, and you thought I didn't notice." I set down the glass I was drying. "He said he's my brother," Elena said. "He said family forgives. And?" I said Andrew is my husband. "The man you told our friends at our wedding wasn't good enough for me. The man you've been mocking for as long as I can remember. Andrew gave you every opportunity to be decent." Her voice was level, quiet, absolutely certain. "Every single chance. You chose this." I crossed the kitchen and held my wife for a long time in the warm light of our flat above Kelvin Grove Park. With the city going about its evening outside the windows and the sounds of Glasgow, rain on the glass, the distant traffic, the particular urban pulse of a city going on living its life, and I thought about what it means to be known, not performed, not managed, known. The specific and irreplaceable quality of being seen accurately by the person you have chosen to build a life beside. Not the version of yourself you've worked to project or the version others have decided to receive, but the actual version, with all its history and all its patience and all its careful, sustained, decades-long work. She had watched, she had understood, she had waited with me without knowing the details because she trusted the shape of who I was. That's not a small thing. Colin called my mobile later that night. I was in my study, the study where it had all begun, where the camera was still in the reference book and the monitoring firmware was still running on the router, though there was nothing left to monitor. He called at 10:30, and I could hear in the first breath that he had been drinking. Not heavily, just enough. Enough to have loosened the grip of the composed, functional performance slightly, enough to let through what lay beneath it. The Colin that existed below the salesman, below the big gestures confidence, below the assessments he dispensed so freely of other people's worth. "Andrew," he said, "just that." "Colin," I said. A long silence, the kind that has texture to it. The silence of someone organizing themselves toward a question they aren't sure they want the answer to. I waited. I had learned, over many years of many different kinds of conversations, that the quality of waiting varies depending on what you're waiting for. When you're waiting for a negotiation to resolve, there is a tension in the waiting, an alertness. When you're waiting for information you need, the waiting is a kind of listening. When you're waiting, as I was now, for someone to arrive at a question they should have asked themselves long ago, the waiting is something quieter, more open, almost gentle. "Why didn't you just tell me to stop?" he said finally. "If you knew, why did you let it go so long?" I'd thought about this. I'd thought about what to say if this moment came. I'd actually prepared something in the professional part of my mind that has always tended toward preparation, something that carried the weight of what had happened, something that would close this cleanly with the force it deserved. But sitting in my study, with the November rain against the window and Colin's voice on the phone, drunk and diminished and genuinely asking a question he genuinely didn't know the answer to, I found the prepared thing sitting hollow in my mouth. Not because it wasn't true, because it wasn't necessary. Sometimes the simple thing is the most devastating thing. Sometimes the most cutting answer is the one that doesn't cut at all, because it doesn't need to. "Would you have listened?" I said. The line was quiet, not the stunned silence of someone who has been struck, the different quiet of someone who has been asked a question and is, perhaps for the first time in a long time, actually considering it. Sitting with the honest weight of it, turning it over. Would he have listened? We both knew the answer. He would have laughed. He would have called me sensitive. He would have said it was banter, just family banter, no harm meant. Can't you take a joke? He would have been more careful for a week, perhaps two, and then he would have resumed, because the belief that underpinned the behavior had never been examined, had never been required to account for itself, had been fed for years by silence until it had become load-bearing in his sense of himself. He needed to believe I was less than him. He needed it the way some structures need a certain beam. Remove it, and the whole architecture shifts. The belief in my inadequacy was not incidental to Colin's sense of himself. It was, I had come to understand, structural. He could be the intelligent one, the perceptive one, the one who understood the real world, because I was the one who didn't. He could be the capable one, the one whose judgment mattered, because I was the one who needed guidance. Every piece of his self-assessment that involved a comparison to me required me to be less than him. And since I had allowed him to believe I was less for years, the belief had grown deep roots. I hadn't removed the beam. I'd replaced it quietly, with something that couldn't support the weight he'd been placing on it, and waited. "I'll leave you to it, Colin," I said. I hung up. I sat in my study for a while after, in the quiet. The monitoring software was still open on one of my secondary screens out of habit, though the logs were empty now. Nothing moving in the night network, just our flat in Kelvin Grove going about its sleeping. I looked at the reference book on the shelf. I'd take the camera out tomorrow, clean it properly, maybe put it away. Maybe not. It was a good camera. I thought about the 17 days between when I'd first seen the access logs and when Marcus found them in the Sterling systems. 17 days of watching, waiting, building. I thought about the thousands of small performances of incompetence, the deflections, the false deferences, the carefully maintained gap between who I was and who I was allowing Colin to believe I was. I thought about what that costs, the sustained act of concealment, the way it lives in your body as a kind of constant low-level tension, the effort of the performance. It was worth it, not because of the outcome, not just because of what happened in conference room C or the signed confession or the 300-400 coming back to us. Those were satisfying in a precise, practical way. It was worth it because of what I learned. People show you who they are when they think you're less than them. They stop performing. The consideration, the courtesy, the small daily civilities that hold relationships together, all of it falls away when someone believes they have the advantage. What's left is the actual person unguarded, operating from their deepest assumptions about the world and their place in it. What Colin showed me over months and years of Sunday dinners and work visits and late-night computer access was a man who had built his identity on the architecture of others' diminishment, who needed to believe that the people around him were less capable, less accomplished, less deserving, in order to feel adequate himself. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was cruelty in the service of a fragile selfhood, the lashing out of someone who is perpetually threatened by the proximity of competence he cannot claim for himself. Understanding that doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And explanation for me is the beginning of the work I can let go of. There is a kind of freedom in explanation that anger can't provide. Anger needs a target, needs the other person to remain the shape they were when they wronged you, because the moment they become understandable, they become human, and humans are harder to remain angry at than monsters. I had never made the mistake of making Colin into a monster. He was not a monster. He was a man who was afraid, who had managed his fear for decades by deciding that the people nearest him were lesser, and who had one day made the mistake of acting on that decision in a way he could not take back. I don't forgive him. Forgiveness is not the same as understanding, and I've never seen the virtue of the conflation, but I no longer carry him. He is a chapter, closed. The morning after that phone call, I went into the office early. West George Street at 7 in the morning has a different quality from its midday self. Quieter, cleaner, the city not yet fully assembled for the day, the light still low, and the pavements catching the reflections of the street lamps in the thin November rain. I walked up from the car park with my coffee from the place on the corner that opens at 6:30, and I stood for a moment on the front steps of the Sterling Dynamics building before going in. I have a habit of threshold moments, pauses at the entry to things, a practice I have maintained without ever quite deciding to. They are a kind of acknowledgement, an accounting of what is being carried and what is being set down. That morning, standing on the wet stone steps with the rain against the back of my collar and the city gathering itself around me, I took stock of what the preceding months had cost. The sustained performance, the patience, the careful architecture of what I had built and allowed to unfold. It had been worth it, as I have said, for what it revealed. But it had also been tiring in the particular way that any extended performance is tiring. The way that holding a shape for a long time leaves the muscles that held it sore when they finally release. I went upstairs. I opened my laptop. I looked at the Munich logistics files, the real ones, the ones Colin had never seen, the ones that represented 14 months of the actual work I had actually done, and I felt a quality of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the preceding night, nothing to do with Colin or Conference Room C or signed confessions. It was simpler than all of that. It was the satisfaction of a man who knows what he has built and does not require anyone's confirmation of it. That is, I think, what it means to be settled in yourself. Colin moved to Bristol 6 weeks later. He found a position there with an insurance firm, selling policies rather than properties, a lateral move in the long sideways career he'd been conducting for 15 years. He sent Elena a message when he arrived, brief and unexpectedly plain. He was settled, the flat was fine, he hoped we were well. Elena replied, "Glad to hear it, take care of yourself, we don't speak." Elena talks to him occasionally, birthday messages, Christmas texts, the minimal maintenance of a relationship that has been renegotiated into its honest shape. Polite, bounded, defined by obligation rather than affection, which is what it always was, beneath the performance of closeness. What's changed is that no one is pretending anymore. There is, surprisingly, a quality of relief in that. Relief and something else I hadn't anticipated, clarity. When the performance of closeness is set down, you see the actual shape of what remains. In Colin and Eleanor's case, what remains is the simple biological fact of shared parents and shared childhood, and the residual warmth that attaches to both, separate from the complications of who the adult versions of those children turned out to be. It is not nothing. But it is also not what either of them had been maintaining the pretense of for years at family tables across Glasgow. The performance of closeness requires energy from both parties, and when one party withdraws from the performance, the other is freed from maintaining it. Eleanor has said, once, quietly, that she hadn't realized how much of her Sunday energy had been spent on management, on the careful calibration of what could be said and what needed to be deflected, and what required the kind of patient, absorptive tolerance that families develop as a survival mechanism over years. She hadn't realized it until it stopped being necessary. The relief of its absence told her more about its weight than its presence ever had. Margaret came to the flat the following Sunday for dinner, just the three of us, and at some point during dessert she set down her spoon and said, "Andrew, I owe you an apology." I told her she didn't, that she hadn't raised Colin to be the way he'd been in my home, in this office, at her own table, that people make their own choices, and hers had been to try to call attention to something wrong when she saw it, which took more courage than most would summon. She looked at me with that clear water directness that age had given her. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "You said something when it mattered," I told her. "That counts." It was true. At that Sunday dinner, when she'd asked Colin why he always spoke to me like that, she'd planted something. Not in Colin, perhaps, whose certainties ran too deep for a gentle question to dislodge them, but in the shape of what was visible, in what Elena could no longer pretend not to see. In the record of the room that day. I have thought often since about Margaret's question and what it represents. She hadn't had the full picture. She hadn't known about the monitoring or the fabricated files or the quiet architecture of what was being built. She'd simply seen something that was wrong and named it at the cost of a moment's discomfort. At a family table where discomfort was the last thing anyone was supposed to produce. And in naming it, she had done something that evidence alone, however precise and however complete, cannot do. She had made it witnessed. She had said out loud, in front of people who mattered to Colin, that what he was doing was visible and was wrong. These things matter. The quiet, precise naming of what is wrong. It matters, even when it doesn't immediately change anything. 18 months after all of this, Sterling created the senior vice president position. It was real this time. The office, the salary, the car. They offered it to me at a Wednesday morning meeting in the same conference room C where Rebecca Chen and Thomas Brennan had sat across from Colin Hutchison with a folder and a camera and 2 decades of someone's careful work. I remember the meeting with particular vividness, the morning light across the table, the familiar view of West George Street below the window. The faces of the board members who had been watching my work for years and had decided, based on that work and nothing else, that it was time to formalize what had long been true in practice. They did not offer it as a favor or a gesture. They offered it as the logical conclusion of 19 years of evidence, and that distinction between a favor and a conclusion is everything. A favor requires gratitude and performance. A conclusion requires only acceptance. What I remember most from that meeting is not the offer itself, but the quality of the conversation that preceded it. The board chair, a woman named Catherine Weil, who has run her own professional life with the kind of precise, long-horizon thinking I have always respected, said something in her preamble that I have thought about many times since. She said, "What we value here, Andrew, is the consistency, not just the results, which have been exceptional, but the consistency, the same quality of judgment year after year, regardless of what was happening around it. That's the thing that's rare. Results can be circumstances. Consistency is character." No, I have turned those words over many times. Consistency is character. It is perhaps the truest thing anyone has said to me in a professional context, and it resonates with what I understand now about the preceding years, about Colin and about myself, about what the long patience of staying quietly yourself in the face of sustained dismissal actually is. It is not passivity. It is not patience as virtue. It is the daily, ordinary, unremarkable practice of being who you are, regardless of what the room is asking you to be. And it is, I have come to understand, among the most demanding things a person can do. I accepted. Elena was the first person I called. Her response, when I told her, was not congratulation exactly. It was something quieter and more particular than that. It was the sound of someone receiving a piece of information that confirmed something they already knew, and the specific warmth of that confirmation. She said, "Good. It was always going to be this." And then she asked what we were doing for dinner, because Elena is a woman who celebrates with practicality as often as with ceremony. And I love her for it completely. I am still at Stirling, still in the Kelvin Grove flat, still in Glasgow, which is a city I have loved for the length of my adult life, with its grey skies and its river and its specific brand of directness, the quality this city has of not tolerating pretension for long, of eventually, inevitably, calling things what they are. I think of it sometimes as the most honest city I know. Glasgow does not perform warmth, it is warm. It does not claim directness as a cultural virtue. It simply is direct, sometimes uncomfortably, always authentically. I have spent most of my adult life in this city, and I am still regularly surprised by it, in the best possible way. My study still has my desk, my laptop, my work, the reference book on the shelf, the window that looks out over the park. I work there in the evening sometimes, and I do not watch, do not monitor, do not wait. I am simply a man at a desk doing his work in a flat above Kelvin Grove Park in a city he loves, married to a woman who has known him for more than 20 years and has never, not once, suggested he was anything other than exactly what he is. The test is over. The chapter is closed. Marcus Webb, for what it's worth, received a formal commendation from Thomas Brennan's department 6 weeks after all of this resolved. He was also offered a lead position on the new endpoint monitoring project that Stirling launched the following year, and he took it. I heard through Thomas that he'd called the commendation unexpected and the offer overwhelming. I was glad. Some debts are small, and paying them costs nothing, and the paying of them matters anyway. I sleep better now than I have in years. There is something worth sitting with before we close this story, something that goes beyond Colin, or corporate espionage, or the specifics of what happened in Conference Room C on a November Thursday. What this story is really about is a question that most of us have been asked by life at some point, in some form. What do you do when someone consistently sees you as less than you are? When their diminishment of you is not a mistake or a misunderstanding, but a choice, a settled, recurring choice, rooted in something they need to be true? The instinct is to correct it, to prove it wrong, to perform achievement loudly enough that even the most determined disbelief can't hold. But that instinct, legitimate as it feels, hands the other person a power they don't deserve. The power to determine when and whether your value has been sufficiently demonstrated. Research on this pattern, the psychology of interpersonal contempt and what therapists sometimes call vertical positioning, the need to place oneself above others in a fixed hierarchy, shows consistently that correction and argument almost never work. Not because the facts are wrong, but because the contempt doesn't arise from factual error. It arises from need, and needs are not addressed by evidence. What works is what Andrew did in the end, the combination of documented truth and strategic patience. Not silence masquerading as acceptance, but silence in the service of clarity. The discipline of waiting until the full shape of a situation is visible before responding to it. The courage to let things become undeniable before naming them. Dignity in situations like this one is not the absence of response, it is the precision of it. And what is perhaps most striking about this story is not the setup or the exposure or the legal consequence, but the question Andrew asked at the end, the one that mattered most. Would you have listened? That question, simple as it is, contains the only answer worth reaching. Some things only change when the cost of staying the same becomes unbearable, not because someone asked them to. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, start by hitting the like button right now. It genuinely helps more people find these stories, and stories like this one deserve to travel far. If you've watched someone who underestimated you eventually face consequences, or if you know what it feels like to stay quiet when you could have spoken and let time do the work instead, tell us about it in the comments. Those conversations are always the best ones we have here, and if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Because we put out new stories several times a week, and the algorithm is not kind to people who wait. Where in the world are you watching this? Drop your city or country below and the time, because every single time we do this, the geography of who finds these stories surprises us. The video on your screen right now is waiting. It is another story of someone who was written off, dismissed, counted out, and made to feel small by people who should have known better. It is longer and quieter and more devastating than this one in a specific way I think you'll feel in your chest. Watch it next. You will not regret it.